Hello and welcome to Talking Geopolitics, the fortnightly podcast series from Geopolitical Futures. I'm Christian Smith in London. After a disastrous 2020, a fractious election campaign and the dramatic scenes of 6 January, what comes next for the United States? Are we entering a new, unprecedented era of American history, or have we really just seen it all before? Later in the podcast, George Friedman will talk us through his book, The Storm Before the Calm, and what he sees as the recurring cycles of US society and politics. We also take a break from forecasting and turn to history to remember the Alhambra Decree, which was signed on the day of this podcast's release, 31st March 1492. But first, on this fortnight segment of What's on Our Radar, we speak with Philip Orchard, who's been following the protests in Myanmar, where 113 civilians were killed on Saturday by the military during protests opposing a coup that took place in the country on the 1st of February. How do you see the situation there, Phil?
Yeah, it's just getting worse and worse. I think what the military thought, or at least the military leadership, I think, Myanmar is an incredibly difficult country to govern based on its legacy from colonialism, its geography, its ethnic makeup, and so forth. As we often talk about, the core of the country is surrounded by upland areas that are filled with ethnic militant groups. Some of them very well armed. Some of them that basically run their own autonomous regions. And so the impulse among the central government in Myanmar has always been to clamp down and sort of build out a fortress against outside interference and make sure that they're in position to at least try to do what they can to stabilize the country. So that impulse is very much playing out today. But what's different now is, over the past 10 years, they've been experimenting with this, experimenting with democracy and with international engagement and so forth. And I think, and as that has blossomed unevenly, but it has nonetheless very much blossomed, I think the generals assumed that we got a little bit nervous about losing too much control to the civilian government and decided to clamp back down. I think their thinking is that, look around our region. Thailand, the Thai military takes power whenever they please, and that hasn't cost them engagement with the West. Cambodia, Philippines, and so forth. There's lots of, to various degrees, authoritarian governments in the region, and I think they thought that they could retake power without really disrupting the status quo too much. But the really monumental and persistent response from protesters and from the Myanmar people, it's sort of put the generals in a position where they either have to back down and lose face, or continue pushing forward and just try to stabilize things by force. And they clearly are choosing the latter option over and over and over again. So it's hard to see how things get better from here. So where do you think it's going to go? So if you think about it, the way I would kind of look at it is like, okay, what's a mutually acceptable solution? And it's hard to see a peaceful way out of this anytime soon. I think what's either going to happen is the military will succeed in suppressing the protests for long enough that they eventually just peter out, and then they can kind of go from there. Or there's going to have to be some sort of counter coup or something like that from other factions of the military that are upset by the overreach, that that are nervous about how much this is isolating the country again, and we're forcing the country to rely on its historical enemy, China, and so forth. It's hard to see the generals doing something like just throwing up their hands and saying, okay, we hear you, we'll hold elections again, or we'll restore the civilian government or something like that.
Philip Orchard, thanks very much. It is 529 years to the day since Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand II of Spain issued the Alhambra Decree. On 31 March 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, known as the Catholic monarchs, signed the decree to expel all Jews from Spain. Just a few months earlier, the final Moorish stronghold in the south of modern-day Spain had fallen, ending La Reconquista after centuries of Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, discussions around 15th century Spanish Catholic anti-Semitism may not seem like the most typical topic for a geopolitics podcast predicated on the future. But as we take a look at this day in history, Alison Viderka, Geopolitical Futures Head of Analysis, and Cole Altum, Geopolitical Futures Managing Editor, are here to explain the significance of the decree for today's geopolitics. Cole, let's come to you first. What was the sort of context that led up to this decision of the Alhambra decree?
Yeah, you touched on a couple of important points that I kind of want to expand on. I mean, first, you're right, the Alhambra decree or Alhambra edict, it's known as both things. That in and itself is not all that interesting for our purposes today, but the circumstances and sort of the geopolitical environment surrounding it are. So a few notes on that. Like you said, one of the early Islamic empires, the Umayyads, had controlled parts of Iberia starting in the late 1700s. The empire eventually collapsed, as empires tend to do, and they left behind these smaller, more or less independent, I guess you could call them small kingdoms in southern Spain. And the efforts by the Europeans to retake the peninsula is what we call the Reconquista. So I'm going to gloss over just a ton of history. You fast forward hundreds of years, hundreds of battles. Ferdinand and Isabella, they get hitched in the 1470s. They combine their houses, and they essentially finish the Reconquista. That culminates in the fall of Granada, like you mentioned, in 1492. That's a very familiar year, and we'll get back to that in a second. And it essentially gives birth to what we now call kind of modern Spain. The geopolitics and the political jockeying kind of get lost in the shuffle here. But what happens is Ferdinand and Isabella immediately began to consolidate power, or rather they kind of began to expedite some of the efforts that were already underway. That includes, arranged marriages, military expansion, all that good stuff. They were also already engaged in purging Spain of what they saw as infidels. Christian, you refer to them as the Catholic king and queen, and there's a reason for that. Obviously, we all remember the Spanish Inquisition that's been immortalized by Monty Python and Mel Brooks and all manner of other people. That actually happened about 14 or 15 years before the fall of Granada. And I don't know for a fact if Alhambra is technically considered part and parcel of the Inquisition, but it's definitely a spiritual successor. It was issued in March of that year. It was, like you said, it was the expulsion or forced conversion of Jews on the peninsula, and that serves a couple purposes. One, it rids the country of any potential nodes of power that may challenge their power, which is tethered tightly to the Catholic Church. So it's not just that the monarchs were religious zealots, although they may have been. It was also, it had these political motives, right? And so the fact that they were now the undisputed rulers of the whole peninsula, that kind of gives this a little bit more teeth. So around the same time, they sponsor Christopher Columbus to find a westerly trade route to Asia. He failed. He accidentally, if you believe my elementary school teacher, discovered America. But he didn't even really do that either, whatever. The point is that the Alhambra Edict and the voyages of Columbus and all these things that are happening, that's only happening because Ferdinand and Isabella defeat the Moors, they consolidate power, and that ushers in this whole new era that's, in hindsight, probably more consequential than it seemed at the time. The Spanish didn't invent colonization, obviously, but they opened the gate to the New World, and obviously New World colonization has changed the course of human history. I mean, the story of the United States becoming a global superpower, you could argue, starts around 1492. So if I haven't butchered that history enough, I'm going to kick it over to you, Allison, because you're an expert in all things Latin American. So you can probably correct me where I'm wrong and kind of give us a sense of how those colonization efforts were constructed, how they feed back to the crown, and all manner of other things.
Yeah, and Allison, so there's a bit of a nice touch of, I want to say, almost cinematic kind of convenience to the story where the Jews, according to the edict, had been ordered out of Spain by the end of July 1492. But over the first couple of days of August that year, there were quite a few Jewish people still leaving. And that was at the exact same time that Christopher Columbus was himself leaving from the Palos de la Frontera on the 3rd of August, 1492, to head west on his first voyage of discovery. So, like Cole was saying, could you just expand a bit more on how this sort of all intertwined in the consolidation of power that allowed Spain to then develop its power in the new Americas?
The key to all of this is what you've both have already emphasized, which is this is all connected. And I want to add another element to this, which is Spain's relationship to the rest of Europe. So Spain consolidated power. What does that mean? It means the domestic control that Cole covered in terms of getting a political structure in place in society in a place where you have unquestioned control. He talked about his relationship with the Catholic Church, which was an important institution to back the legitimacy in some ways of the government. But we also need to keep in mind in Europe, throughout this entire time, war was rampant. There were divisions between Protestants and Catholics. There was competition for spheres of influence. And from the beginning of colonization, and even in the years prior to colonization, Spain was engaged in war almost constantly. So they had issues with the British, they had issues with the French, they took on the Ottomans, you name it. So the conflict was rampant. And so when you are fighting all of your neighbors in a place like Europe, you need resources to be able to sustain this type of competition. And what Spain ended up doing, and what some of these other countries also ended up doing, is looking elsewhere. So where else can they garner power? They've consolidated their home territories. They're fighting wars all over Europe for influence and to defeat one another. So they look overseas. They've heard stories about how there's riches, how there's resources, and they all go overseas. And Spain was arguably the most successful country to colonize the Western Hemisphere. As Cole mentioned, this started around 1492. And what Spain did when they ended up colonizing this area is the entire purpose and the entire structure for the administration, economic development, and all of that was centered around how do we get these resources back to the crown in Spain so that we can continue to bolster this monarchy, to win these wars, to keep Spain strong, to defeat our enemies. And so in the 1700s, they even went one step further, and they created what they call the Bourbon Reforms, where it was further administrative and economic consolidation over these colonial holdings in the Americas. And if you look at it, they had things in place. We talk a lot about how the infrastructure in the region was set up to kind of extract resources and get them to ports and export them out. And that is a characteristic we see today. And that is also in part because that's kind of how it started out when Spain arrived. They took all of these resources and they sent them back to Spain. The colonies were not allowed to trade with other European countries. But on top of that, they weren't allowed to trade with each other for the vast majority of their existence. So a lot of these economic practices were kind of ingrained into the region. That's not to say over time you can't see how technology can help you overcome things and diversification can help you overcome things. But the entire framework and basis and underlying political and economic institutions upon which Latin America was founded were primarily influenced by Spain, and that was primarily a decision made by the crown at the time to extract as much wealth and resources as possible so that they could continue to consolidate their domestic power and take on all of these wars that they were fighting in Europe. And so we see those remnants today in different parts of the region. So this is really a case in point where you can see how one event really fits into a bigger picture, and not only that, but the ramifications of that event through this case, Spanish colonization of the Americas, has actually had a very long-lasting impact both on the region's development and economic and political structures over the past few centuries.
Well, it's one of those ironic ways of history, isn't it, that you know, in your own time, we often, there's a tendency to overestimate the importance historically of some events that you're living through and underestimate the things that will really make the difference. So I think that's a really great example of that. I also have to say that I never expected to talk about the Spanish Inquisition on a geopolitics podcast, but I guess no one ever does. Alison and Cole, thanks very much, and we will talk to you again soon.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
In his book, The Storm Before the Calm, Geopolitical Futures chairman George Friedman argues that America is constantly in the midst of two cycles: the socio-economic, which usually lasts about 50 years, and the institutional, which lasts about 80. The 2020s will be the first time where each cycle has come to its conclusion simultaneously. Notably, however, since the book was released at the beginning of last year, it's fair to say that a lot of water has passed under the bridge. In this episode's Fireside Chat, George explains what he means by these cycles and why the last year hasn't changed his forecast. So, George, The Storm Before the Calm essentially argues that America runs on these cycles. You've got the socio-economic cycle and the institutional cycle. Can you explain a bit about their history, about how you see those, how they work?
Well, they work this way. The United States operates on a very speedy motor. It's a speedy motor because in an invented country, you're constantly running out of fuel for one way of doing things. You move on rapidly to the other. You won't find this in many European countries or so on. But it's not simply that we are inventive. At a point, the inventiveness exhausts itself and has to be replaced. So, for example, the period that began with the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, who, if you don't know him, is one of the men who certainly stole his election. But he also introduced the gold standard to the United States. And while it has many shortcomings, it fueled the Industrial Revolution because investment, large-scale investment, suddenly was very attractive with a dollar pegged to gold. And what happened was that between the Civil War and 1900, the United States went from being a nation slaughtering each other to a nation that produced half the industrial products in the world and exported them. And that was an extraordinary achievement. And the exportation to the world was wonderful. And we were the China of 1900. We were relatively poor, relatively industrial, and very entrepreneurial country that managed to take this position. The problem is that we were highly dependent on exports, which means we had to be highly dependent on our customers. And our customers decided to start a really bloody war in Europe. And the countries that were buying from us, like England, France, Germany, and so on, were in no position to continue purchasing. So after the end of the war, we wound up for a period still continuing and then fell into a major depression that was driven by the fact that the Europeans simply could not sustain their consumption. And we didn't know how to solve this. And we went into a crisis that President Roosevelt presided over. And the solution was to increase domestic consumption, which the Chinese are trying to do now and is not very easy to do. We got out of that with World War II. The United States found World War II enormously profitable because it gave everyone jobs. It allowed us to export weapons to various allied countries at, if not profit, certainly at cost. And it created an entirely new era. An era, for example, that had what's called a GI Bill, where everybody who was at the war was allowed to go to college for free. It created a massive middle class, a massive professional class. It created a brand new society, a brand new way to live. And that led, to an enormous period of time until suddenly all the consumption that was going on in the United States ran into the problem. There was very little investment. And that could only be solved by more investment. And Ronald Reagan came in and decided to cut income tax rates for the rich and hold them steady for the poor, which of course caused outrage, but worked because that gave us the transition, this transformation of the microchip. Without that, the massive investment that it took to do this, Steve Jobs, were he alive, would still be in his garage trying to figure out what to do. And we're now ending that period and moving to the next one because really the microchip economy is no longer cutting edge. Just as the automobile technology drove the Roosevelt age and then became, simply commodity, it wasn't exciting, or electricity really drove the period of Rutherford B. Hayes and transformed the cities, these things come to an end suddenly in the United States. And it's that sudden ending that's always jarring, because we do it with operatic rage. We do it with intense mutual contempt. And all of our changes did. I mean, the 60s was a time of riots, murders, assassinations, all sorts of things. The Roosevelt transformation involved the Ku Klux Klan, somebody called Huey Long, who was quite something. It was not a peaceful time. So we are in this period now, and that's really the social and economic range.
Now, so we're going to, I guess, come on to what's going on at the moment shortly. But so that was the socio-economic cycle. The institutional cycle tends to be a longer one, doesn't it? How does that work?
Well, it's an 80-year cycle. It was 80 years between the revolution and the Civil War, and that changed the relationship between the states and the federal government. The outcome of that war was the federal government could tell the South to stop slavery. 80 years after that came World War II. And in World War II, we changed the relationship between the federal government and the state and society itself, because in World War II, we essentially nationalized the economy. We took control of everything, and we now had the sort of state we're living with now, where the federal government oversees everything from rules on autos to COVID. So we're now reaching the end of that cycle because it's kind of created a new problem. And the problem of the new cycle is the relationship of the federal government to itself. And here's the problem. The federal government learned about living with expertise in World War II. World War II, where the British invented radar and we invented nuclear weapons and all of this, it was a war of invention and of mass production. And experts were able to do that, and they did a marvelous job on our side. They were also critical on the German side, not so marvelous. But what you wound up with at the end of it was a federal government that still had the World War II model, where experts were called in. Now, experts have many varied uses, particularly in their areas. The problem is that very few problems are solved by experts in a single field. You have very complex problems that cannot be solved by one. And how do these experts, these silos, cooperate? One of the things that the federal government lost was what I'll call common sense. It lost common sense in the sense of there was no one there who looked at the entire picture and overrode the experts. The experts had a holy position. So when COVID broke out, for example, who do we turn to? Well, obviously the medical profession. And the medical profession had no solution. The only one they could contrive was staying home wearing masks and not getting close to each other. Well, that's a reasonable thing while waiting. But the question was, what was the cost? Well, the idea that a child not going to school and playing with other children can create, dangerous people. The idea that mothers could no longer work, more mothers had to stop working so that the father could work, just happened to be the way society was built. There were many things, loneliness, depression, but that wasn't a medical problem. And the medical authority said, this is the solution. And the problem was, as in many other countries, a rebellion against the solutions being proposed, because the cost of the solution was to many people higher than the risk. So where the medical profession's expertise says there is no higher calling than preventing death and disease, these others disorderly demanded, there is another solution, we'll take the risk. And then the federal government backed up the medical solution, and it became a major political thing.
A good point is just to jump in, because I think we're going to come on to this idea of the medical profession and technology and the importance that has in the US just in a moment. But before that, just while we're talking about COVID, obviously your book was published just over a year ago. It was February last year. And I remember you saying around the time, you were saying, that you were going into TV studios to talk about your book at the same time as they were covering the beginning of the pandemic. And it was this sort of hectic time. How has the pandemic influenced or kind of made you rethink the sort of forecasting you did in the book, or do you see it as part of the wider process that's still going on?
Well, I certainly didn't expect COVID. In fact, the book was published on February 25th, and the U.S. shut down on February 27th, which really played havoc with the book tour, by the way. But the important thing is that while I didn't anticipate COVID, I anticipated the confrontation between Dr. Fauci in the United States and his detractors. What I anticipated was that the government of expertise had created a system that was unable to grasp the whole. That, for example, Social Security, I believe, was 15 pages long as a bill. The rules regulating the new healthcare bill was 15,000 pages. I don't believe anybody has read all of it. No one is quite sure what's in it. But each part of it is really excellent. The problem is that we don't live in parts. We live in the whole. And there was no one to oversee it and say, guys, you can't have a 15,000-page rule book. The experts say, why not? And someone with common sense says, because we're a democratic government and this cannot be read by the people. And there was no one there to say that, because the World War II rules, just dominated, which was turn the problem of a nuclear bomb over to experts and you'll get a nuclear bomb. But you don't get the question, do you really want to have a nuclear bomb? Well, probably people would have said yes, but it was a highly debatable thing later. So in a democratic society, the inability to understand what your government has promulgated, coupled with the fact that the people who wrote that book were very few of them aware of a range of other problems, such as how few people in hospitals and medical centers really understood the book and could guide their patients, and can create not just havoc, but distrust. So what I'd argued is that we would have, as a result, growing distrust of the government. If you don't understand the government, well, then you distrust it. But also in the First Amendment to the Constitution, it says you will have the right to petition the government. Okay. How do you petition the government when you don't understand what question to ask? And there's no one to really petition, because the nice person sitting in the booth really has no authority to change anything or anybody. So you wind up in a dual crisis. One, expertise and its interface with democracy is very complex. You need both, but the tension grows. And the second is the First Amendment's guarantee of the right to petition government is really theoretical. For major corporations, they petition the government by lobbyists. That's fair enough. But for the ordinary American, the ability to petition the government falls by the wayside. And so the expectation there was that we would have tremendous tension as we reach the end of this 80-year cycle over the World War II model, that people would simply not accept the basic assumptions of the experts, not only because they ignore them, there's no debate in the federal government between experts. And so one of the things we saw was that the Trump's voters, particularly, who really were more than anything else distrustful of the government, distrusted the vaccine, distrusted Fauci and the things he was saying. The distrust embedded itself. It could have been either side. In fact, I'm sure we will have against Biden within the left wing there, that sort of distrust. But this distrust kind of breaks the system down, and you must have a transformation. I should note that all of the institutional changes take place in war. First is the Revolutionary War, then the Civil War triggers next, World War II. I think that this is also being triggered by war. The war in the Middle East. 18 years of inability to define what the goal was, inability to define what the solution was, inability to win the war. We had really brilliant generals. We had brilliant people in foreign policy. We had brilliant people all over the place. But nobody to stand back and say, these are really silly guys. 18 years. They're so focused on solving the problem the way they do, they can't back off and take a look and say the problem's not worth the price of solving it.
Now, you say in the book, as we touched on earlier, new technologies are key to how America's cycles kind of work and driving along and solving problems. And in some ways, these new technologies come along and help to solve problems that they're potentially not actually related to in the bigger picture of things. You've got the microchip, electricity, internal combustion engine, and that sort of thing. And with COVID coming along and this kind of these issues that you've been discussing with the medical community or medical science, what we now need is a new sort of technology to help us push through. How do you see that playing out?
All of our technologies emerge out of social necessity. No one invests in them otherwise. Our new social necessity is medical. It's not necessarily COVID. It begins with a demographic fact. People are living to an older age. The millennials, as we call them, are having fewer children, which means in due course, you will have the elderly as the largest voting bloc, and they're going to vote themselves all sorts of benefits at the cost of the millennials. But the bigger cost is obviously that they also suffer from serious disease. The elderly consume massive amounts of medical help, and they're very expensive to keep alive, which we will do. So the medical need is to make them productive. The problem is not that they're old, they're not productive, and by making them productive, they release the cost. And so what we look at here is finding a way to make them live longer, but healthier and productively, and that is the overwhelming social need. At the same time, we've learned something, which is that something like a virus, we're not really ready to deal with it, except by masks and isolation. I mean, we don't have a methodology of developing solutions in a very rapid period of time. So my expectation is that just as the microchip dominated the last cycle, the last 50 years, next 50 years are going to be dominated by medical advances, because it has to happen, because the alternative is to euthanasia on the old. And given the fact that I'm getting old, I really object to that. So that can't be the solution. And morally, it can't be the solution. And economically, we can't go on the way we're going. So that has to be the place where the bucks are laid by the investment bankers and the rest.
George, I think we could probably talk about this for quite a lot longer, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you again in 2 weeks' time.
See you then.
That's all we have time for on this episode of Talking Geopolitics. My thanks to Phil, Alison, Cole, and George for their time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you have, please make sure to subscribe both to this podcast and on our website at geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast. We'll be back in a fortnight, but until then, take care.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.